Hello, this is David Bank with ImpactAlpha's Returns on Investment with a special Agents of Impact episode. I'm here with Bertrand Badré and Pratik Basu from Blue Like an Orange. Welcome.
Good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having us.
Blue Like an Orange was launched in 2017, and I think one of the first questions people always ask is, Blue Like an Orange, is that the name of a fund? What is with the name? Give us the story.
It's a name which has a lot of meaning, but also it's strange enough that people raise the question. So it's a wonderful icebreaker.
Well, let's break the ice. You have any blue oranges in your office to make the point?
Yes, actually, I have some at home. Actually, someday I'll show them to you. No, more seriously, it's a reference to a French poem from the 1920s by a surrealist French poet called Paul Éluard, who wrote "Earth is blue like an orange." And it was a reference to a book that actually I wrote 15 years ago with Michel Cantus, the former managing director of the IMF, on the financing of water. And it started as Earth should have been called ocean because it's blue like an orange. And what is interesting with that poem, he says that it compares Earth to an orange to show its fecundity, but also its fragility. And that's really what we have in mind when we started that. And I've been able to convince my non-French speaking partners to.
we have a betting pool, David, that it's either the first question or the last question asked whenever we're in a conversation, and so I don't know what we're up to yet, Bertrand.
Well, I'm glad I could pay off somebody's bet with my first question. But I'm also educated now and I love the fact that it's named after a line in a surrealist poem. So that makes a. And just a little bit about yourselves. I know you come, Bertrand, from the World Bank. So why leave the bank and start a fund like this?
Well, actually, it's more than the bank. I spent 25 years, my 25 professional years in all corners of finance. I've been a partner in investment bank in New York, London, and Paris. I've been the group chief financial officer of two of the largest banks on earth. I've been an advisor to President Chirac on development issue, actually working in particular on the tax on plane tickets, to give one example. And then finally at the World Bank. And when I witnessed the collapse of the financial system on the one hand, and the need to move on sustainability on the other hand, I've tried with my partners to connect the dots and say, how can we redesign the financial system so that it's really built to develop a sustainable approach to development for the 21st century. So that's where we're coming from. I wrote a book at that time called Can Finance Save the World, subtitled How to Regain Control on Money to Serve Common Good. That's where we are coming from.
Well, I want to get very much to whether finance can save the world. But Pratik, I know you also ran something called the MDG Health Alliance. Before the Sustainable Development Goals, there were the Millennium Development Goals. So you've been at this for a while.
I came at it a bit more from the development space at the World Bank, and then running the international efforts of our one of our founding investors, a gentleman named Ray Chambers, when he was the UN Special Envoy for Health. And so we were very, very involved in the Millennium Development Goal period, and I think just came increasingly to the realization that no matter how much public money we throw at our global development aims, there's just not enough of it out there. We've got to tap the private capital markets to achieve the goals. And so when Bertrand was leaving the bank and we were increasingly concerned with this issue, Ray and our team, we decided to join forces in what's become Blue Orange, to see if we can truly mobilize some private capital for this new, much more broader set of goals that are the SDGs.
So let's turn to the SDGs because it seems like a long time ago, but it was only 2015 they were adopted, and the world really actually came together. I think it was 193. I may have that wrong, or maybe more have joined. Countries affirming these 17 goals, quite ambitious. Ending hunger. Universal access to safe drinking water. Very much a utopian vision that the world endorsed. It's now 2020, 5 years on. How are we doing?
Well, actually, I think it's a fair point to remind everybody that it was just 5 years ago, even if for a number of people it seems like an eternity. If you remember the momentum in 2015, not only did we adopt the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, but we also moved on financing for development in Addis Ababa in July, and then we moved on to Paris on COP21 on climate the very same year. So we really put the bricks of the Sustainable Development Framework for the 21st century. And then here we are 5 years down the road, and it's true that there is a little less momentum. So maybe, Pratik, you want to add from your perspective, but I think we are not there, and we've been 1/3 out of the 15 years which were targeted initially. So the positive news is that people understand more and more what we're talking about. The negative news is that there is not enough action.
Yeah, I think it's on one hand it's been 5 years. On the other hand, that means we have 10 years left. And, the power of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, over their predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, of which there were 8. Those goals were very targeted, very focused, and some would argue written in a somewhat top-down fashion. And there's power in that, but there's also some weaknesses in that. The SDGs were written in this very, very wide country consultative process, and so that's how you end up with 17 goals and hundreds of indicators. So the upside of that is true universal buy-in. The downside of that is, where do you start? What do you focus on? How do you prioritize? So there's a risk that it's kind of all things to all people. So there are positive and negative elements of that, and I think that's resulted in some areas of the goals being a little slow to get out of the starting block. But we need to get much more serious, much tighter about them with 10 years left on the clock.
And the big witness I witnessed when I was managing director of the World Bank at that time is that we gave more thought to the goals than to how to get there. And in particular,
Right.
The underlying financial framework was kind of assumed we'll find a way. But we never really discussed in detail what was needed to change the financial system, public and private, to get there. And 5 years down the road, some progress, but indeed little progress have been made in that direction.
I think one of the criticisms or at least observations about them is that they almost implicitly assume that it's basically, government, public sector finance. And even when the way people talk about the financing gap, I think it's sometimes framed as 2.5 trillion. I think the assumption is that that's somehow going to come all from governments and essentially taxpayer money. And I'm not sure that was intended, but I think that's somehow it's been interpreted.
Yeah, that's. At that time, I led the efforts called From Billions to Trillions. That was my concern, and it still is. Public money available to fund development is in the billions. That's the type of money that the World Bank, the various development banks, most official development assistance is about. And what we need is trillions. You can discuss whether it's 3, 4, 5, 6 trillions per annum, but that's the order of magnitude. So how do we bridge the gap between the public billions to the needed trillions? And that's where projects like Blue Like an Orange come into play.
We've been trying to reframe it as, that's more like a market sizing number. That's the size of an opportunity that could be an investment opportunity that wouldn't be a, money down the drain, so to speak. It would be money that would come back in as returns on those investments.
Yeah, it is an investment opportunity, but that investment opportunity, in some ways remains theoretical unless there's a translation exercise, right? Otherwise, it just becomes it's such a vast pool of investment opportunities. Someone has to then work to translate those opportunities into things that actually have a degree of commercial return. And so while there's a fair amount of rhetoric of, look, we have this massive gap. Look, there's all this money sitting in the private sector, trillions of it. How come it's not going to support the goals? Well, it's never going to really support the goals unless you have that translation, both from an investment opportunity as well as from a measurement opportunity.
Well, let's dig into this because, as you say, I think at first there was quite a lot of enthusiasm and even I think maybe surprising level of embrace of the Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody aligned or mapped their activities to one or more goals, and then I think there was a little bit of a kind of I don't know if backlash is too strong a word, but a little bit of a reset that said, well, if everybody can map everything to the Sustainable Development Goals, then have we really moved the ball forward. So then people tried to say, well, is there some way to really more activate it as you're
I
saying?
think one of the things, and this is important for the DNA of Blue Like an Orange, it's we have not spent enough time to understand the financial sector. There is an offer and demand, so you have to work on the products. You also have to work on who are the players. What are they expecting? What type of constraints are they facing? They are facing risk constraint. They are facing search for yield constraints in a zero rate environment. They are facing compliance issues and so on and so forth. And so you really have, and that's one of our concern, is to make sure that people talk to each other and understand each other. And the truth is that quite often everybody is on his own silo, on his own lane, and don't want to listen to the other. So I think one of the very important things is to have more and more people, as projects say, who translate what's going on. So to build products that really fit what a life insurer in Europe might be willing to do, what a pension fund in the US might be willing to do, what a sovereign wealth fund in the Middle East might be willing to do, and find the right channels that people are familiar with what they are doing and understand where they're putting their money at play. If not, it's very difficult. We should never forget that first, we just exited a terrible crisis a few years ago. And second, we are in a very uncharted territories of zero rate and geopolitical anxiety. That is the backbone of everything we are discussing. So our job is to make sure that we understand this and find the way to navigate this in an appropriate manner.
Right. I think I was also a bit surprised to the extent the SDGs were embraced by so many, particularly embraced by so many in the private sector as a macro framework. I think that the folks over at the Global Impact Investing Network, something like around, or saying something like around 72% of the respondents in our recent surveys use the SDGs as a common framework. I know UNDP is working on a set of standards that guide fund managers toward these investments. But you do hear these words like align and map thrown out, and as we started thinking about that, what that meant for us as an explicitly SDG focused fund, just didn't seem like it was enough, because what you end up doing, and it's just natural, is you end up finding a deal that you like, and there's a real temptation to almost back in to the icon or to the goal that makes the most sense, and that's how you get to your SDG impact. And that just didn't feel right to us. We wanted to figure out a way to flip it and really have take the SDGs seriously, and actually really have it guide how we even select deals, and how we diligence deals, and how they move through our process.
So tell us a little bit about your internal process, and then I guess you've now taken that internal process and turned it into something that others can use as well.
I think, coming back to my previous point, I think our job is to make the life of investors as easy as possible. We should never underestimate this. I mean, you will never force money to go to a given place if you don't help it go to this given place by making it easy, straightforward, transparent, etc., etc. So our job is really to make sure that SDG finance, SDG connected finance, is not a side bucket, but becomes mainstream. That we really incorporate into the decision-making process of investors on Earth the idea that sustainability is core and not kind of nice add-on. It's not just risk and return, it's risk, return, and impact, or risk, return, and sustainability. And to get there, you have to make their life easy. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think, Bertrand, the point you just made is so critical. I mean, what we're attempting to do, at least, is we don't want to be a kind of we don't view sustainability as a side project, or when we find an investor, to have the investment come out of some side sustainability sleeve. I think we're looking for this to be a core mainstream product. But I think Bertrand's point is an excellent one. I just can't overestimate how difficult that can be, and how the internal incentives all the way across can make that very challenging. So we need to make it, it's our job collectively, those of us who care about the impact investing space, is to make that decision making as easy and as almost pre-chewed, pre-digested as possible. And one way in which we're trying to do that is for us internally, is to make the SDGs a bit more digestible for us from an investment perspective.
Well, there are a kind of flurry of frameworks and guidelines and certifications. Even the International Finance Corp is running funds through a kind of process of their what they call operating principles, and everybody seems like they've got some kind of framework. In some level, the complaint now is maybe too many frameworks, and so it's the attempt to simplify has itself become quite complex.
I think it's a necessary moment in time. I mean, there is no master of the world to decide this is it. And it's probably okay. So I think we're at the moment where we should really discuss and engage and test, etc. And Pratik will come to that. We want to be part of that debate in a totally open manner. I don't think proprietary systems are the name of the game today. The second point is also, what do you want to measure? Again, that gives the impression of being confusing. But some people are discussing the way to measure, let's say, CO2 emission. Some people are trying to assess the way you make an investment decision. Some people are trying, and this is what we are doing, trying to assess how is my dollar impacting the world, be it in a water project, education project, or health project. How do you compare them, etc. So I think it's okay. It's a little confusing, and it will remain confusing for a while. We should not doubt about this. Again, there is no master of the world, but Pratik, maybe you want to add to this.
No, to me, I think it's said correctly, Bertrand. To me, it's about a transparency of process. I don't see there being a convergence on a single process anytime soon, and I think that's totally fine. And I think the focus on ratings and certifications, while one could argue there's a lot of them, and we're participating in I think most of them. I think overcorrecting for that certification probably isn't a bad thing in the short term, just to make sure that we're holding each other accountable to a high bar. I think certification, though, is different from how one goes about measuring impact and an impact measurement frameworks that you could use as an investor. And I think it's fine that different investors have different impact measurement frameworks. Personally speaking, I just think that it'd be helpful if everyone were completely transparent about how that impact measurement is done. And so for us, when we were thinking about how we translate the SDGs for ourselves as investors, we didn't put this together in some ways to go out and try to sell something. We developed this because we needed it. So it really emerged out of necessity.
So just walk us through, if you can, at a high level, how you think about both assessing impact at the front end of an investment and then measuring it as you go forward, and what you're calling SDG Blue.
So it's a continuous dialogue we have with our clients on the SDG front. We're very clear with them up front with regard to the focus of our investment vehicle, and we expect that to be a journey of the life of the investment. And every investment, as it moves through our investment committee, we're a credit fund, so it gets a shadow S&P style, Moody style credit rating from a commercial standpoint. And what we were finding as we were just getting off the ground is we didn't really have a similarly consistent way of looking at the SDGs. We would find ourselves using terms like narrative and mapping and alignment, and it just didn't seem good enough. But then if you actually look into the SDGs, you find that there are really written with a bit more of a public audience in mind, particularly if you go all the way down to the indicator level. And so what we decided to do is like, okay, well, is there a way of translating the SDGs into something that's a bit more investor friendly for us? And in doing so, we came up with a rating system. Essentially, it's a series of weights and measures similar to what we do on the credit rating side. It weighs the different SDG impacts that a particular investment we think will have, takes weighted averages and adds it into points, and then converts that into a letter grade. And we made a decision to actually, given the breadth of the SDGs, we can't be all things to all people. We had a debate and a discussion internally as a team to say which are the goals that we think, no matter what we invest in, no matter what the sector is, we're going to hold constant. And we picked four goals to do that. We picked job creation, gender equality, innovation, and sustainability, as we thought, sector agnostic, everything has to hit, or every investment needs to be measured against those bogeys. And then we have other goals and related to the business itself that we're investing in that we factor in. And I won't get into the details here, but basically we apply weights to those different areas and sum it up to a rating. And what we do is we assign an initial rating as it moves through our investment committee process. And then every year, and then there's a series of indicators that are developed and baseline data collected. And then every year we refresh the scoring. And that's, again, an iterative process with our borrowers. But like just as we refresh the credit rating, we refresh the SDG Blue rating as well over time and see how we have improvements, but potentially deteriorations in the portfolio that we then have an ability to manage.
Well, just at the process level, are you go looking for investments that will move the needle on particular SDGs at the outset, or do you find a good investment and, as you say, map it, ex post facto back to the SDGs?
Well, we have sectors that we focus on as an investor, and so we have sectoral, quote unquote, notional allocations, I'd say, for our investments themselves, whether it be and we have allocations for healthcare, for education, for agribusiness, for clean energy, technology, and so we use the sectors as our initial sieve, I'd say, and look for investment opportunities that map to those sectors. And then within those sectors, we run the SDG analysis that we do. But the starting point is what are the sectors in the countries of our primary areas of focus, and then we run the credit assessment and the SDG assessment based on that initial kind of sectoral cut. And obviously, we seek to find a nice balance of sectors across the portfolio, balance of sectors and balance of countries as well, obviously.
And what would you do when, as you say, you go back and refresh it each year? What would you do if the SDG score, is that what you call it, or the rating, the grade, goes down from one year to the next?
Well, one is we take note of that, and that's a conversation we'll obviously have with our borrowers. So even being able to recognize that it's gone down, I think Bertrand and I would argue is a very good thing. Obviously, not a very good thing that it went down. And then we would start interrogating with the borrower. Why is it that there was a degradation, and how do we correct it essentially? And obviously not all downgrades are the same, and for some there could be very good reasons, very good commercial reasons why something went in the negative direction, and so we want to know why actually. So it would begin a dialogue with the company. What we're not doing is using it as a punitive mechanism. We're really using it as something that the first step is information transparency and dialogue, and then what can we do about getting it back on track?
And I think what Nick says is extremely important. I think dialogue is the key. Since we first meet with a borrower at the beginning till the end, we have to discuss. The SDG is very familiar to a very limited number of people on Earth. And most of the time, when you go to a potential borrower and you explain him what we are talking about, it's not that they are opposed to it, that most of the time they're not very familiar or they don't know anything about it. So I think it's important, I see that as part of our mission, to also disseminate that approach and enrich that approach. Because you can also have cases where there is a degradation because people don't know. It's again, you really have to. It's not another Washington consensus type of approach where the nice Western people impose a view of sustainability to the rest of the world. It must be a very inclusive process, and I think it's very important to remind this again and again and again.
Bertrand is making such an important point here. You mentioned, David, at the outset that 193 countries agreed to these goals, which is astounding to get 193 countries to agree to anything. And so we should bear that in mind. But when we engage with entrepreneurs, private companies, and at least for currently in Latin America, there's generally sometimes a knowledge of what the goals kind of are, but not really. They're busy running their businesses as best they can, and they believe in the societal impact they're having. And so I think Bertrand and I have both been really inspired that once you walk them through the goals, walk them through why we at Blue Orange are focused on the SDGs, they themselves get excited, and they then know their companies the best, and they provide us with suggested indicators, and they begin the dialogue. And I've really been, I think both of us have really been inspired by the degree to which there hasn't been this pushback from them saying, "Oh my God, another reporting burden, or what do these guys want? Fine, let me give them what they want because we want their money. Quite the contrary. You start really digging into a conversation with them, and that's how the goals really catch on fire. I have found that. I think both of us, Bertrand, have found that as being a really inspiring part of the investment process. Yeah.
Well, you've made three investments so far, and I don't know if you want to pick one and tell us a little bit about how this scoring system worked, and you can describe the investments better than I can. But pick your favorite child.
Like parents, we don't have favorites. We love all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I would take. I know we talked about it once before, but I would talk about a company like Cabify, for example, which is a ride-hailing company that we invested in. I think 5 or 6 months ago. At this point, I'm losing track of time. Um,
I used it. I've used it repeatedly and happily in Mexico on a
Have
trip
you?
recently.
Good, good. We're very happy that you had a good experience. We'll pass that along to management. But there is, as you might remember from our earlier conversations, David, we feel there's a substantial impact the company is making, both in terms of, for example, an SDG 5, which is a mandatory goal of ours, as I mentioned before, on gender safety, gender equality. They're doing specific trainings for how to attract and retain women drivers on the Cabify platform. Traveling alone as a woman in Latin America, as in many parts of the world, can be quite dangerous. They suffer from harassment, etc. So we have that, and in a dialogue with the company, score what we feel the impact on a 0 to 10 basis the company might have on gender equality. And in this particular case, without getting into all the details, we added everything up, and we came up with a score of I think it's 6 on Cabify for that. We looked at environment and climate in terms of SDG 12. Cabify is already a carbon neutral company. They're very proud of that. And in addition, we have an indicator in the company where we work with them to look at the average age of the fleet, and the age of the fleet is the proxy for how clean their fleet, how clean their vehicles actually are, with the assumption that the older the vehicle, the more potentially pollutant it could be. So in that particular case, it got a 7 for its stance on climate and sustainability. And so on and so on and so on and so forth. So basically, we kind of take those 4 mandatory goals, apply them against the company. We take, for example, goal 9, which is a goal on innovation. Innovation in that goal is a very, very broad SDG, and within that SDG includes things like use of mobile technology platforms, etc. Cabify is a ride-hailing company. It uses an app. It's even trying to look at underserved populations. We're doing a pilot with them, looking at underserved populations in Lima to see if there's a way of tracking whether or not the cars are going to underserved areas, and then in those areas, whether or not you can even start toggling pricing to encourage safer, better access to ride-hailing services, to transportation in underserved areas, and so it gets a high score for that. So on and so forth. We take all these measures. The investment team is allowed to even apply some bonus goals if it really thinks it's hitting it out of the park on a couple of topics. All that's add up to a scoring, and that then converted into a letter grade, essentially. And then we keep track of all of these on an annual basis, and we see how the company does.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate. That all sounds good, except I wonder whether financing for ride-hailing companies is really what people have in mind when they think of the financing gap for the SDGs.
Just a first comment, and then I'll hand it to Bertrand. I think the point you're making is really a really interesting one, David, because it's you use the term is what people think of, or the phrase what people think of when they finance the SDGs. And one debate we've even had internally is on that. We can, I'm happy to speak for an hour as to the positive impact of a company like Cabify. But you're absolutely right. When people quote unquote think about impact, a lot of people think about things like climate, or they think about agribusiness, think about healthcare at the bottom of the pyramid. But if you actually look at the SDGs, the 17 goals, the targets, and the indicators, they are a broad framework for sustainable development. And so if you truly take the goals seriously and get down to that indicator and goal level, you'll find that companies like Cabify knock it out of the park. But there is a narrative gap between what people quote unquote think about when they think about impact and the goals to which 193 countries have actually agreed to. But Bertrand, please.
Yeah, no, I think, and we've been through that process, as Pratik said, internally. Coming from areas like the World Bank or health, we had this photogenic image of impact equals solar panel, windmills, hospitals, etc. And it is part of the impact narrative. But the truth, and we've discussed with potential with pension funds, life insurance in the world, we think about this, and we had this dialogue with them. And the truth is to have company which in the new areas of development are behaving in an exemplary manner matters as much as the photogenic impact. It's very important that you have companies that put SDG at the core of the way they operate. It has a lot of sense in emerging and developing economies. But of course, it's more difficult to put on a glossy report, or you have to put it in a different manner. But I think it's very important to have a broader perspective than just the usual nice pictures that we all have in mind.
I probably should have raised this earlier, but just the kind of capital you provide is sometimes called, I think, mezzanine debt. It's not equity, which sometimes people think about in these funds. I think of them as sort of standard private equity funds. That's not you. So what is mezzanine or subordinated debt, and why is it important?
I think it's an instrument which is, I would say, everything which is not straight equity and everything which is not straight senior debt. It's really structured debt, which basically provides flexibility, like grace period, the capacity to capitalize your interest, the capacity to pay part of the interest as a income sharing feature, and so on and so forth. So it's very flexible. And the truth that this mezzanine debt is something which is extremely common in Europe, extremely common in the US, and I would say mostly in OECD countries. But you don't have access to that type of products, or in a very limited manner, in most emerging and developing economies. Whereas these are typically the countries where it's really something that would make a difference. For an entrepreneur working in this country, where the banking system is what it is, so with limited access to entrepreneurs, etc., the capacity to provide flexible debt instruments, which are really customized to satisfy the expectations of the entrepreneur, has way more value. And that's where we're coming from. It's really to address this gap so that in the shelves, in emerging and developing economies, you can offer much more than traditional equity, and you have a lot of private equity funds. You can offer more than traditional senior debt, and you have some of it with the banking system or most of the development institutions, but you have very little provider of flexible financing tools, and that's what we are bringing to the market.
You mentioned the development institutions and sometimes called the development finance institutions, which one would think would be providing this sort of debt that might be riskier than commercial debt. I think there's a little bit of a perception out there that they're not willing to accept much more risk than commercial banks. Is that the in some sense the gap you're filling?
Well, I'm not sure we are filling that gap, but it's true that it's one of the issues that these development institutions are facing, and I've been leading one of them. So they are part of this very big debate where, on the one hand, they are incentivized to take risk, and then when the risk materializes, they are blamed for having taken risk. And so I think it's important that people like us can provide this kind of riskier instruments, bringing in private money, but we do it in relationship with IDB. We have an agreement with Inter-American Development Bank to work together, and that's part also of the key building blocks of Blue Like an Orange. For me and for us, it was important at the beginning to really find innovative way to join forces. As I said initially, one of the big issues I discovered when we worked on this SDG and climate in 2015 is that private sector think private, public sector think public. Sometimes they say, oh, let's blend, but they don't mean it really. Everybody is way more at ease to do what is familiar with. And I think to find new ways to join forces is essential, because none of the SDG will be achieved by just the public or the private sector. It's not true. It will be achieved because people are capable of working together under, I would say, the benevolent control of civil society. And that is really the target that we have as Blue Like an Orange. We want these people to work together. And it's difficult because they are not naturally capable of work. As you very well know at Impact Alpha, it's a lot of effort to get
Yeah,
there.
and it's entirely different languages sometimes that are spoken entirely. So there's a translation exercise, as we discussed before, that's really critical, and that people have to play.
I think you're going to roll out this SDG Blue framework and at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos this week. And Davos is kind of an interesting animal in itself. You talk about the translation mechanism. At some level, the reports and the rhetoric comes out. It sounds very much like, as you mentioned, the heady days of 2015 with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Yet Davos often gets ridiculed and criticized as sort of the playpen of the global elites and not really down for the saving the world mission that it sets for itself. So how do you reconcile these kind of the contradictions inherent in a place like Davos?
Say it's not, these contradictions are not only Davos. I mean, you could feel exactly the same when you go to the UN General Assembly or the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. So to all of these meetings where you have a lot of people, what you call the global elite, meeting together for a few days and committing to changing the world. And then you realize that it's not that easy. So no, but that is true. It's a very fair question, and there are very good reasons why these meetings are vilified or ridiculed. But that's really the point we are making. And that's why we've created Blue Orange, because we are part of that, and we say it's really time to walk the talk and to move beyond commitments to action. This being said, I don't want to ridicule the commitments too much now. For one, and again, we had the same issue with the Business Roundtable call end of August to say let's move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholders capitalism. People say this is another proof of washing. Maybe, but on the other hand, in today's world, when you put your signature at the bottom of a page where you say I'm going to do this, this, and this, you put yourself at risk in today's world. People will hold you accountable. So I think the I would say the Davos game or the UNGA game or whatever game has been pretty I would say benign for many years. I think you're putting yourself at risk if you commit now to make a real difference.
I agree. I think the skepticism obviously is healthy, and it's quite warranted. But to others, I'd say, well, what would you prefer? Would you prefer them to not make these statements? Would you prefer for them to not sign on that bottom line? I'd rather have these folks sign on the bottom line, put themselves out there, and then we should all hold each other to account. At least then there's something to hold them to account for, because now everyone's out there, and even folks like the regulators, even folks like the SEC are now looking at ESG and applying scrutiny to that, and frankly, we I think we should collectively welcome that attention.
Yeah, I agree with that part. My question really is, what will it take for that global agenda to become a popular, or even a populist, to use the current language, movement where in fact it's not derided as global elites, but it's actually seen as improving the actual lives of billions of people.
I think, and it's an extremely difficult question, and I'm working on a book on this. It's really, we cannot just change the world with a system as it is defined today. And what do I mean with that? We're really in a, let me call it, neoliberal or capitalist system, which has been engineered in the 60s and 70s around the shareholder capitalism approach. The social purpose of business is to make profit. I mean, you know the whole story. As long as we don't change it for real, and it means changing the accounting rules, the compensation rules, the way you define IRR, the way you integrate externalities like the price of carbon today and the price of nature tomorrow, the way you report, you disclose, etc. The system will not change, and so everything which will be good will be done based on the goodwill of few institutions, few people, few individuals. I mean, you cannot just rely on the great, nice CEO of Danone or Unilever to change the world. This being said, it's important that these people are there and show that it's doable, but it's not enough. As long as you don't change the system, as long as you have no incentive built in the system to do the right thing, it's not going to be enough. And the issue, we are back to the no master of the world problem. There is no master of the world to decide how you change the system today, contrary to the 60s and 70s. So that's why we have to do our best, because this is our responsibility. But to go way beyond that, this is really the fight of this generation.
Well, I very much look forward to that book, Bertrand, and I look forward to our next conversation about this. That's obviously sets us up very well for the next conversation. But let's leave it at that for now. And I thank you very much, Bertrand Badré and Pratik Basu from Blue Like an Orange. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for having us, David.